So I'm around chapter 8 or 9 of the New Testament and its World, Part 2, which the audiobook, which I've been enjoying. I came to realize last week that this is really a seminary level New Testament survey class in a book. So that's really what this book is teaching. It doesn't give you the homework, it doesn't give you the in-class discussion, but that's what this is. It's really the textbook or the audiobook for a New Testament survey class. And if you're not familiar, when we say survey means it's an overview. It doesn't go too deep, but it gives you the major themes, concepts, and context so that you can see the big picture of all of the books in the New Testament. So the takeaway for today has been, so they're talking a good bit about the Gospels and what was written when, and even some of the epistles. I can't remember if it's this chapter or the previous one. But so when you're looking at scholars and the Bible, there's a there's a lot that could be said. There's liberal scholars, there are conservative scholars, and we're not talking about politics. Though there is a parallel. There's a reason why some are called conservative and some are called liberal. But the point is, conservative theologians tend to take the Bible more at face value and try to fit things within the time frame of the Bible. Liberal scholars tend to take it more either symbolically, or they don't take it as truth. They tend to dismiss things more easily and not try to reconcile things, and even say there are errors in the Bible, which makes it really easy to dismiss certain parts of the Bible. And then there's people in between called moderates, and there's a whole spectrum, just like in politics, amongst people that study the Bible, theologians. There's a range of views. So conservative scholars would say that all of the New Testament, except for maybe the Gospel of John, was written prior to AD 70. That's when they're more or less situated and when the authors lived. John could be written before, it could be written after 70, it could be written as late as 95. We actually have a fragment of a copy of it from 120 AD, so it had to be written by then. But moderate scholars are going to date more of the documents towards the late 60s to early 70s to 2nd century. And then the liberals are all over the place depending on the document. Because remember, the New Testament is a collection of books and letters. And so each one has its own history, meaning you can look at where it went, what does it say, how were the copies made, how many copies were there for each document. But the summary statements are helpful for kind of just giving a generalization of them all. All right, so when we're looking at the New Testament and its world, these scholars are more on the moderate side of things. They're trying to date a lot of the writings, especially the Gospels, towards the 60s and 70s. They even said like Matthew and Mark were probably written either just before the temple fell, because it prophesied it and reminded people that it was coming and the urgency of it, or right after because it was fresh in the memory. So you have that. So when you're looking at Matthew, these scholars suppose that Matthew didn't write Matthew, that instead, because Matthew follows the pattern of Mark and a lot of the content covered in Mark, that Matthew more than likely was written by a disciple of Matthew who based his writings off what Matthew said in his preaching and Mark. I don't give a lot of credibility to that because I don't think that there's enough reasons to believe that Matthew didn't write it. Then the issue of Mark. They date Mark pretty late too, around 60 AD, 65, in the 60s. I don't think it's that late. I think it's a little bit earlier than that, but besides that, with Mark, there's a debate amongst all scholars on which one was written first, Matthew or Mark. And the, the hard part, and even in this book by N.T. Wright, he's talking about how Mark is not an eyewitness. And that's true. So why did he write first, if he wrote first? Well, he doesn't cover it in the book, or I just totally missed it. But the understanding is that Peter and Mark were around each other a lot. Mark heard a ton of Peter's preaching. Peter preached the life of Jesus over and over as he told people about the gospel. And Mark decided to sit down and write it, or use a what's called an amanuensis to write it. In the ancient world, literacy was not super common. It's not commonplace. Better vocabulary. And so a lot of the discrepancies in use of vocabulary and how did these illiterate fishermen write type arguments, or arguments that are against the New Testament based on that kind of reasoning, they fall flat because there were people that you could pay to write down whatever you said. Now, it's expensive. One paper or papyri, what they wrote on, was super expensive back then. But hiring someone to write for you was also expensive. So there's a cost issue, but in the end, that's not a major issue. It's just what it was. That's why there weren't a ton of copies, a ton more copies than there were. There were seemingly a lot of copies of them. So anyways, the takeaway for today is to remember that if you're going to read or listen to this book, that these scholars have a lot of great content, a lot of good background information, a really good perspective, but they also come from what I would consider a more moderate standpoint on the dating and authorship of the New Testament, which I think has problematic implications. I think if you take away, say, Matthew from Matthew, and you give it to one of Matthew's disciples, who was not in the time frame of the other eyewitnesses. Because to me, one of the key things about the Gospels that makes them unique and authoritative is not just that they're God-breathed, but one of the reasons that we believe that God inspired those books is that they were written during the times of other eyewitnesses that could have countered any information that was false. Because there had to be an additional layer of authenticity to these writings. And if they're going to be late, if they're going to be in the 2nd century, for example, then their authenticity is highly suspect. But if they're situated in the 1st century, especially before AD 70, which they certainly could be, and most likely were, then that gives them more authenticity and more credibility from a secular standpoint. Of course, God could have used anybody at any time to write these things, but the picture that's being painted in the New Testament is that these things are being written within a couple of decades of the events in question by eyewitnesses. And that's the major point, is the eyewitness angle of this, that even though, say, Mark or Luke were not eyewitnesses to Jesus and his ministry, they had access to eyewitnesses, and God seemed to use them to interview those type people and to write down certain things that he wanted to convey to us. Now, another very interesting theme in this book, and it's very common for this type of study, is that every gospel, the 4 gospels, has a motive. You might have noticed, if you've ever read the gospel side by side, that some of the stories are in different order. And there is some literary, editorial choosing in that. In the ancient world, when you're writing a biography, which a gospel is a type of biography with quotes, that's a literary genre of gospel, as well as the meaning of good news, gospel. It's kind of a dual meaning there. When you're looking at why they would be writing and similar writings from that time period, they could write with an agenda. It didn't change the truth of what was being said, but they could change the order of things to emphasize a point. They could minimize some things and go in detail on other things to help drive a point. Let's say the kingship of Jesus, or Jesus our Savior, or Jesus the humble man God. Each one of those is a theme of one of the different Gospels, or that's what scholars have taken to be the themes of some of the Gospels, based off of what is written, what is emphasized, and that kind of stuff. So it makes for a really interesting study. I haven't done one of those in a long time, so I can only generalize at this point. But it's a great study, or if you get a good commentary, to read the introduction and see what it says the theme of the book is. Well, that's it for today. Have a good one.